New take. I am officially anti-common sense. Fuck common sense. When we look at data, there are so many things about this world that we do not understand. We are monkey-brained. Hello everyone, today I'm going to be doing a breakdown of this PragerU video, and it is, quite frankly, awful. Now, a quick thing about PragerU. They're a think tank. Their job is to indoctrinate people into Christian conservative right-wing propaganda. They do so by spreading misinformation, misunderstanding studies, and creating a system where strict Judeo-Christian morality is reinforced through their clever rhetoric and propaganda. Quite frankly, their videos are high production, high quality, and that makes them very, very persuasive, because to an audience that doesn't know better or can't think critically, most people who are conservatives, and also a lot of younger children, this comes off as mind-blowing. But here's kind of the issue. Much like modern anime, PragerU replaces substance with style. And so I want to take a look at today's video. Today the video that I want to look at is this one from PragerU. Fewer penalties, more crimes. Now, let's take a watch together.
The role of the prosecutor is to pursue justice. This primarily means enforcing the laws passed by the representatives of the people. Enforcement protects citizens from future crime, but also offers some measure of satisfaction to the victims of crime.
Alright, first things first. When we talk about Christian morality, strict Christian morality, we're thinking about strict father morality. This is the idea that there's something called a just world hypothesis. This is a separate entity, but the just world hypothesis, which is the idea that we live in a just world, and if bad things happen to you, it's because you were deserving of it. That there's a God, he looks out for all of us. If bad things happen for you, you kind of deserved it. Because why else would God let bad things happen to good people? You must be secretly bad. Now, this isn't their main ideological focus, but this underplays a lot of their rhetoric. They're trying to tell you that sometimes bad things happen to people and they kind of deserve it. And regardless if people deserve something, bad things can still happen. And to get good things for yourself, you kind of have to earn it. You have to be worthy of it.
This is the basis of civil society. But over the last several years, a growing number of American cities have elected prosecutors who are de-emphasizing enforcement. This is by design. These prosecutors openly vowed to reform the criminal justice system by means of selective prosecution. Their motive, seemingly well-intentioned, is that criminals do better when they're not incarcerated. That many people who are in jail shouldn't be there because they don't present a danger to society.
Exactly. Here's the thing. Most people that are in jail probably shouldn't be in jail. Here are the reasons. If they're in jail because they were buying or selling drugs, caught with drug possessions, marijuana, cocaine, opiates, usually it's better off treating that as an addiction issue and sending them to rehab. That creates better societies and makes sure that you recidivist. And also, here's kind of the issue. Prisons are traps for recidivism. You take a 19-year-old boy. Okay, 17 years old, he stole something. 18, he was caught with drugs. 19, he carjacked with a couple of friends. 3 strikes, he's in prison. That's a felony right now. You've taken a young, impressionable boy, who probably didn't have role models, probably didn't have a father figure, and put him in a box with hardened criminals. We wonder why the rate of recidivism is so high in the United States. It's because we're sending a lot of impressionable young people to places where they're hardened criminals. And if they don't have a role model, we know this, they will find role models. This is an issue especially for young men. I talk about this in my book. Check that out. But if they don't have good role models, they will find ones, and we have no guarantee the ones they find are good. And if they're in prison, they will probably find a lot of bad role models, which is why you see a lot of gangs like MS-13 be born in American prisons and then operate outside.
What does this reform look like? Here are just a few examples. In Boston, Suffolk County District Attorney Rachel Rollins has ceased prosecuting 15 different offense categories, including charges like trespassing, stealing less than $250, destruction of property, and drug possession with the intent to distribute. In Brooklyn, Eric Gonzalez has either refused to prosecute or has rerouted many gun offenders to pretrial diversion programs.
And I don't know why PragerU would have an issue with this, because in New York and Chicago, there's some very strict rules on gun ownerships, which I disagree with. I'm pretty sure most conservatives would disagree with. And gun offenders to diversion programs is something as simple as putting them into training programs to make sure they learn trigger discipline, learn how to protect themselves, learn to de-escalate violence. It seems like a more productive use of even protecting people's Second Amendment rights than simply prosecuting people for having a firearm that might not be strictly legal.
In Los Angeles, George Gascon has actually prohibited prosecutors from speaking at parole hearings. This forces victims and their families to take on the burden of speaking in opposition to early releases. He has also ordered his prosecutors not to pursue sentencing enhancements enacted by elected representatives, including those for third strikes and gang-related offenses.
Yeah, once again, we don't want to try to create a carceral system. Ideally, we would use public policy, prisons, laws, in order to create good outcomes in society. Oftentimes, prisons create negative ones. And actually, there's some pretty good studies on this. There's a study out from states that had 3 strikes laws and those that didn't. And they found that when you have 3 strikes laws, you tend to see an increase in violent crime. In fact, the study finds that with a state level multiple time series design, they found that in the shorter term, there was a 10 to 12% increase in homicides in states that had 3 strikes laws, and then 23 to 29% in the long run. This means that sometimes the 3 strikes laws will increase the rate of violent crime. And this article actually does a pretty good justification. I'll actually get to it later, because PragerU makes a couple more mistakes in this video in analyzing.
In San Francisco, Chesapeake instituted a policy prohibiting prosecutors from seeking bail and heavily restricted their ability to ask for pretrial detention. This is not a fringe movement. In addition to the 4 cities just mentioned, St. Louis, Baltimore, Chicago, Dallas, Houston, Orlando, Portland, San Antonio, and others have taken the same route. In fact, more than 40 million Americans now live in cities with so-called progressive prosecutors. That's a lot of reform happening outside the institutions designed to make the law: state, county, and city legislatures. And that's concerning for a couple of reasons. First is that a single official shouldn't be able to sidestep the political process and decide what laws to enforce or not.
Okay, so by that argument, we should abolish the presidency, because, and here's the kicker, Congress can often create laws and give the job of enforcing them to the president. Sometimes they don't give the president enough funding to enforce all the laws, sometimes forcing the president in spending to borrow. Now, there's another issue here. If you have limited resources and infinite things to process, you're obviously going to employ some sort of hierarchy in order to decide which laws are worth processing, or which laws are worth enforcing. So in this situation, you are already leaving a lot of discretion to people who are enforcing. So you're kind of, by the role of nature of having a branch of government or an official whose job is to enforce, you are giving them a lot of discretion on what they can and cannot enforce. Consequently, the courts can hold people accountable if they're in contempt of court, if they're not enforcing laws properly, if they're over-enforcing. We have some guidelines, but by the very design of our republic, we give people the discretion to enforce how they see fit.
But a second, larger, and more obvious concern is that these changes aren't making our cities safer. Based on the data, they seem to be making our cities less safe.
Now, this is the part where they are the most incorrect, and there are a lot of issues with the way that they cite data and analyze it.
Take, for example, George Gascon's ban on third strike sentencing. In 2007, economists studied the deterrent effects of California's 3 strikes law. What they found was a 17 to 20% reduction in the felony arrest rate among those with 2 strikes. That's a pretty big benefit to throw away on one man's say-so.
All right, so this study is beautifully misunderstood. So there's the deterrent effect of California's 3 strike law. There's a 17 to 20% decrease in felony arrest rates of 2 strikers. So I actually found this great study that might actually be the same one that they cited, but they've done a good analysis on this. So remember when I stated that states that had three-strike laws saw a 10% increase of homicides in the short run, 29 to almost 23 to 29% in the long run? Well, one of the reasons why is that if you have individuals with two strikes, under the conditions, there will be little marginal deterrence to dissuade criminals from committing homicide because doing so lessens the chance of resistance, arrest, and conviction. Consequently, homicide rates might increase following the passage of three strikes laws. So what the study ended up finding was that there was reason for people who had two strikes to cause further harm by eliminating victims or witnesses in order to reduce the likely chance of them being apprehended. In fact, the study also notes that sometimes people will try to move municipalities and avoid being arrested, and so that greatly contributed to this number where there was a decrease in arrests, but an increase in crime. So not only did these three-strike laws not deal with reducing the overall crime, they made it easier for criminals to get away with violent crime, including murders and homicides. So already PragerU is misunderstanding the data and making it very difficult, at least by their own assertions, to dealing with crime.
How about the goal of sharply curtailing pretrial detention? The data out of jurisdictions like New York and Chicago tell us that increasing the number of pretrial defendants out on the street will most likely mean more crimes committed by that population. Crimes local residents could certainly do without.
They were never going to commit crime because they were in custody. So now if they do commit crime, that's an increase in crime. That's only an increased crime because it's possible. We're not looking at as the macro level of making society more unsafe. This is just the fact of life. If people are free to commit crime, some of them will commit crime. When we're thinking about these types of policies, we're thinking about the macroeconomic effects, macro societal effects, on what it does for large populations. So you're going to notice in the studies that they cite, including the Chicago study, that there are going to be some issues in the numbers and data they pick.
Concluded that after more generous release procedures were put in place, the number of pretrial defendants charged with committing new violent crimes increased by an estimated 33%.
All right, I love this study because I actually had to do a lot of research because it was a difficult study to understand. So I was really confused on how we could see such an increase of crime in pretrial detentions, given the fact that by the admission of this study, only 0.6% of people in pretrial detention commit violent crimes, So how do they come to this number that there's a 33% increase? Well, it really comes down into methodology because this study is a response to a previous study that showed that there was a decrease in crime committed by pretrial defendants. This study notes that the previous study from the Chicago Tribune, the bail reform study, the previous study from the bail reform study found that excluded certain crimes from the category of being violent crimes. One of those included gun possession crimes. Now, this study included gun possession crimes and violent crimes, and so it seems that there was an overall increase in violent crimes. Now, actually, per this own study, 15 months before the passage of GO 188A, this bill that made it easier for people to avoid being detained, saw that 15 months before there were 143 violent crimes, and then 15 months later there were 147. So within the same period, there were very close numbers. And now, this is the kind of issue. This study accounts that if you account for the corrected violent crimes, which includes gun possession, then yeah, they're going to show a graph where there's an increase of violent crimes. But a lot of those violent crimes are just increasing because you'd redefine what violent crimes were. The study is valid. It actually does raise some concerns about gun crimes committed. But it by no means compares apple to oranges or before to after. Overall, I think this study is very weak, and this is the exact one that they study. In fact, here's kind of the tricky thing that PragerU does. They didn't cite this exact study. What they did is they cited a paper that cited the abstract of the study and not the actual study itself. So after some digging, I could understand exactly how they came to these numbers. Not very impressed with PragerU's research so far.
In New York, the share of violent felony arrests constituted by those out of jail either on reduced bail or released without bail while awaiting trial for previous crimes jumped by more than 27% in the first 9.
Once again, they're not really citing a study here, they're just citing increase in crime. But just citing an increase of crime does not mean anything. Between 2019 and 2020, we had coronavirus, we had runs on toilet paper, we had the emergence of Zoom. It would be just as valid for me to say that Zoom led to an increase in crime because people were upset with their computers, as it would be to say that lower penalties and prosecutions, or being more lenient with prosecutions, led to an increase in crime. The reason is because in neither of those scenarios did I account for confounding variables. Until we can do a proper time series analysis, which is not what PragerU cites here, it's very hard to say what causes an increase in crime. And in fact, I actually have this really good study from California and their 3 strikes laws that found that, this is just reading from the abstract, that over the past 50 years, a multivariate time series model, meaning controlling for multiple different variables across 50 years for California over the past 5 decades, shows that 3 strikes laws had no impact on violent crime in the state, but things like alcohol consumption and unemployment have important impacts on the rate of violent crime. Now, this is California, not New York. I couldn't find a really strong time series study for New York, but I'll extrapolate. It seems, maybe there's a huge cultural difference between New York and California that means that this data wouldn't be able to hold. It seems that there are other confounding variables, things that changed between 2019 and 2020, like a pandemic that caused multiple people to lose their jobs, fall into depression, abuse substances, drink more alcohol. That could have been a stronger determinant of these crime increase that they're talking about than not. So once again, PragerU does the assumption where they see 2 things increase and attribute to a random variable without ever doing the work to try to figure out what is the real cause. But then again, that's what PragerU does. This PragerU is just misinformation. Honestly, nothing that they've said has been accurate. Their constant misunderstanding of the truth, mishandling of it, has made it very easy for them to construct the argument that, in a just world, we should treat people who are good well and people who do bad very poorly. We should be very harsh against people who commit crimes, because somehow it is a sign of moral virtue for us to punish people who do wrong. And it's a very interesting thing because this was a very unchristian message. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth leave the whole world blind and toothless. This is the propaganda of PragerU. This isn't the idea of creating a better society. It is to create a society more in line with their values, where the goal of justice is retribution, not rehabilitation. It's not about creating a better world for these people, but it's by living by certain rules, these tribal, barbaric, Judeo-Christian rules. And that's ultimately the propaganda of PragerU. This is the goal of PragerU. It's not to create a better society. Let's watch the rest of the video.
New York State's bail reform went into effect, and that's compared to the same period in 2019. A few other stats are worth noting. Baltimore's progressive DA, Marilyn Mosby, took office in January of 2015. Between 2015 and 2020, Baltimore has averaged 111 more homicides annually than the 6-year period before Mosby came into power.
Once again, they're not going to attribute a reason for this. All they're going to say is, oh, this person came into office. Oh, look, these bad things happened at the same time. Coincidence? I think not. And that's kind of the issue.
Chicago's Kim Foxx took office in December of 2016. Under Fox, between 2017 and 2020, there were 90 more homicides annually than there were between 2013 and 2016, the 4-year period before she took office. Larry Krasner was sworn in as Philadelphia's DA in January 2018. During the 3 years he's been in office, the city has seen 112 additional homicides annually compared to...
Actually, this is something, right? If alcohol is a big reason for committing crime, we should probably find alcohol consumption. Alright, look. Between 2016 and 2019, there's been a slow but steady year-on-year increase in the amount of alcohol consumed. In fact, the trend goes back all the way from 2010. Could that be a reason why this is happening? We don't know. I've made the stronger argument, even though I don't think it's a very good argument, that alcohol is the reason that all of these crimes have increased, because, at least from our understanding of the data, alcohol is a better predictor than the number of three strikes laws, or the types of three strikes laws, on the level of crime in the state. So, once again, this is kind of the issue of PragerU. This is just misinformation. Saying numbers out of context is a great way to mislead people.
To the 3-year period before he took over. It would be unfair to say that the progressive DAs in these cities are entirely responsible for these increases.
Exactly, but, and here's a key kicker here, you saying this while at the same time claiming this person elected, this increased crime, this person elected, this increased crime. We're not saying they caused it, but look, there are trends. Once again, you're leading people to trends without ever giving them a sufficient evidence or analysis that that trend is true. Make a take on this.
Why certain crimes rise and fall is complicated, but the data is alarming. We all want to see fewer people in prison, but only, common sense would seem to dictate, if they stop committing crime and become productive citizens.
Oh my god, common sense. Ugh. Okay, new take. I am officially anti-common sense. What is common sense? Common sense is, according to PragerU, taking traditional values and your understanding of the world, human behavior, whatnot, and making assumptions about the world. They're like, oh, we're nicer to criminals, they're going to commit more crimes. Common sense, right? Fuck common sense. When we look at data, there are so many things about this world that we do not understand. We are monkey-brained. Even in the social sciences, social constructs of humans, there are so many complicated factors. I'll give you an example. The rate of domestic violence increases by up to 28% for every 10% increase in the concentration of liquor stores. We can say that that's common sense, but also there is evidence that teaching children about sex at a younger age makes them less likely to be promiscuous. That's contrary to common sense. We have so many complicated systems around the world that simple human common sense will never be able to understand or unravel the fundamental truths. That's not even touching to the natural sciences. Common sense can't begin to understand what a black hole is. No. It's why we use data. We use data, mathematics, scientific processes in order to figure out the world, because simply eyeballing something and having an emotional hot take based on our traditional monkey-brained values is never going to be productive in creating a true understanding of the world. We thought for the longest time that the sun and moon revolve around the earth because it looks like the sun sets and the moon goes through different phases. Well, we were right that the moon revolves around the earth, but under proper examination of the earth, other planets, and their relative position, we found that everything goes around the sun. Very anti-common sense because we had to look at new data. What PragerU has shown is that fuck data. Like, we'll cherry pick studies, we'll use data, but ultimately we should govern based off our gut instincts and core values. Never really on the empirical reality of the world.
By all indications, this is not happening. If it were, you can bet we'd be hearing about it. In fact, crime is surging to levels not seen in decades. The victims, all too often, are the people who live or work in the very communities these reforms are meant to help. Reform doesn't necessarily mean better. It can often mean worse. In the case of progressive prosecutors, perhaps much worse. I'm Rafael Mengual, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of Legal Policy at the Manhattan Institute for Prager University.
Greatly misunderstand data, greatly misunderstand the world around them. But that is to be expected. They are conservatives. Have you ever heard of conservatives being smart? Have you ever heard of conservatives understanding data? No. Now, I wanted to talk about strict father morality because it's a very interesting way to understand PragerU and conservatives like PragerU. Well, let's first take a look at their value set. They evaluate people based on what they deserve. Criminals are bad, so they deserve the book to be thrown at them. And if we punish people enough, if we scare people enough, they will be good. Here's the problem. We are assuming that criminals are rational people. They aren't. People will commit crimes Not because they want to commit crimes, not because they are evil. They commit crimes because they view it as a reliable way to have their material conditions met. If you are in a poor neighborhood with a lack of job opportunities, low upward mobility, high poverty, a sense of despondency, a sense of feeling that you don't have any value in the world, sure, you're going to go and feel like committing crime might be your way out. If you're a young man, especially young men, your only role models are gang members and violent criminals, you're more likely going to model their behavior because that is the acceptable type of behavior and the acceptable way of becoming successful. It is not people that create problems. It is not people who create problems, but it is people who suffer. It is systems that create problems. It's not an issue of one person being bad. It's not the issue of a group of people being bad. It's the issue of a group of people being put in a system that encourages more and more bad behavior. Now, here's the thing, right? I have not addressed a lot of the smaller arguments made by PragerU, their examples or whatever. I only addressed the arguments that they made that were backed up by studies. The studies that they cited, they either misunderstood or were externally valid to apply to the argument that they wanted to make. But this is kind of the issue with PragerU. Now, I encourage everyone to stay as far away from PragerU as possible, but I do think that there is a lot of benefit in learning from them. One, a lot of conservatives like PragerU. In fact, there's PragerU kids and they're trying to indoctrinate children. So we need to find a way to rhetorically engage with them and move them away from there. PragerU appeals to the uneducated, to people who don't want to research, people who don't want to study, people who don't want to question their worldviews. So I think that the way that we deal with this is by pointing out the logical inconsistencies and the lack of goals for PragerU. The first step is to first get people to admit that they're not interested in creating a better world, but they're interested in creating internal or gaining internal satisfaction by the punishment of people. Once when we can make that step, once when people can acknowledge that that's their real motivation and be honest about it, we can then make the conversation to get them to accept that maybe we should use public policy to create a better world. And from then and there, we just have to explain to them what these studies say and hopefully push them slowly. Look, I like to call conservatives idiots, and they are. But one-on-one, I try to avoid doing that because that's very rhetorically ineffective. We don't want PragerU. In fact, there's a common sentiment among people on the left, which is Google is free. When someone ever asks a question, we refuse to answer, we refuse to explain, we just tell them to Google it. Unfortunately, after they Google an example of what are trans women, the first response that they get is, "Hi, my name is Dennis Prager from Prager University." And then the shit show starts. PragerU is a misinformation think tank. They are a center dedicated to pushing one type of idea. This is August. They're doing their subscriber month. They are a nonprofit and they are willing and able to try to indoctrinate people, whatever culture war it is, critical race theory, abortion, Afghanistan, Goya beans, Dr. Seuss, Mr. Potato Head, whatever the cultural issue is, free speech on college campuses. Their job is to appeal to reactionaries with the accessible rhetoric of common sense. Leftists need to do a better job being accessible so that people don't follow down this pipeline. I encourage everyone interested in trying to understand about criminal justice reform to read a couple of books. First, The New Jim Crow. It's a good book for understanding how the history of segregation and racism that is built in the criminal justice system. Second, I would encourage people to read Michel Foucault's Crime and Punishment, about the psychology of punishment and how we use it to control people. And finally, I would like to encourage people to start reading data. Whenever you hear these crime statistics and study, try to figure out what is the biggest predictor of crime. People can think any different things can predict crime. The number of Zoom calls someone is in, the amount of alcohol they consume, the amount of violence in their neighborhood, their poverty rate. There are multiple factors that could influence crime. I encourage people to start rating in the biggest multivariate causes of crime. And then they'll have a better understanding of why there's so much crime in cities and how we can create good public policy to fix it. Because here's the thing, if PragerU was in charge of the world, there'd be no public policy, maybe even terrible ones. I care less about getting the satisfaction of seeing bad things happen to bad people than I care less about that than I do about actually creating a good world. And PragerU is not interested in creating a good world, but I hope you, my viewer, are.